check it out. So today he's here to talk about bond agencies and budgets. Please help me welcome Commissioner of Administration Jay Dardenne.
Thank you. Good to be with you. I just raced out of a subcommittee meeting where I hope we're going to have a proposal to present to the Joint Budget Committee on Friday that'll make a few changes in our pharmacy benefit manager program, which has been a bit of an issue since that contract was let beginning January 1st of this year. So they were still meeting when I slipped out, so I'm sorry I'm running a little bit late. Thought what I would do today, and this may be a little bit of a repetition for many of you, was kind of go through with you the presentation that I made to the rating agencies when they came and visited 2 weeks ago. We invited all the rating agencies to come for a visit in Louisiana. They had not been here in a number of years. They're very important, obviously, to our credit rating because the rating that they give us affects our bond issues, affects the amount of interest that people pay for the bonds and the costs that we have in issuing bonds. And we've had a good relationship with them through the years, but we have found that they're oftentimes quick to lower your bond rating, but a little bit slower to raise your bond rating. And we feel like the steps that we've taken over the course of the past 8 years, as well as our budget situation as it stands right now, merits consideration by these agencies to up our rating. So we had all three of the major rating agencies here, as well as Kroll, which is a new rating agency not many people are familiar with, but they've entered the marketplace in rating states and municipalities, and it was our first chance to visit with them, so we included them as well as the three majors, Moody's, Fitch, and Standard & Poor's. We made a very extensive presentation to them, and just to give you an idea, this is the size of the information that we gave them. We had participation in the process. In addition to my primary presentation, Treasurer Schroeder was under the weather that day and was unable to participate, so I made some of the remarks that he was going to make from an introductory standpoint. But we also had Lauren Scott and Jim Richardson make economic presentations to them, Greg Riley from LSU on the oil and gas situation. And we had also presentations by LDH and by the Department of Transportation and by the Department of Natural Resources. I thought it was very important for these agencies to get a chance to interact directly with as many of the folks who are involved at the ground level of making government work. And those presentations, I think, were very helpful. And the comments we got from the rating agencies really confirmed that. They appreciated the opportunity to visit with a wide variety of people and get a lot of information that they had not really had previously. So let me just go over some of this. It's going to be kind of basic, I know, to many of you, but we started with the premise that Louisiana has very strong practices already in place to excuse me, I'm losing my voice all of a sudden. Thank you. Thank you very much, broadcaster to the assistants. And we have constitutional provisions in place that provide a great deal of assurance to these credit rating agencies that Louisiana is going to meet its debt obligations. And obviously, we have never failed to make a debt payment that was owed. We have the Bond Security and Redemption Fund, which all money flows into that comes into the state. It's basically the first call on the state treasury. The retirement systems obviously get paid as well, but paying off our debt is constitutionally mandated, constitutionally protected. We told the agencies that we've had 6 consecutive years of surpluses and that we have a significant excess in the current year that we think will translate into a surplus when this fiscal year ends on June 30th. We talked a lot, and I'll get into a little bit about this later, about the Budget Stabilization Fund, the Rainy Day Fund, and about the new fund that has been constitutionally created, the Revenue Stabilization Fund, which acts as, in essence, a second savings account that the state has. We've also driven down our pension obligation, our unfunded accrued liability, in accordance with a schedule that, if you look at the graph, pretty much high contributions on the front end, but steadily going down and flattening out here for the next several years when our unfunded accrued liabilities are going to be completely paid off. We also, and this was very important, I think, because it's often overlooked, we also made that $800 million payment in 2 consecutive fiscal years to the Army Corps of Engineers for the levy debt that was necessary surrounding the hurricane protection for New Orleans. very significant and negotiated down from what would have been a massive obligation over 30 years had we been required to pay what was obligated at the outset after Hurricane Katrina. That obligation, which was hurriedly and willingly signed and with good reason, was done in order to make sure we could get levee protection around New Orleans as quickly as possible. So the feds fronted the money. The state had an obligation to pay that back. The interest rate began accruing from the day that the contract was signed and extended throughout the entire construction period at a very high interest rate. And the project was dramatically delayed so that the state did not get possession, as you will, or final completion on that project till much later than had been expected, and we're accruing interest all that time. So the negotiations with the aid of our federal congressional district representatives was that if we paid two $400 million payments in successive years and a third payment thereafter on the balance, we could erase this long-term debt. And we were committed to be able to do that. We made those two $400 million payments timely, and also included in that law was that we should be entitled to credit for the money that the state has spent to fortify and add protection around the federal levee protection in New Orleans. And we spent hundreds of millions of dollars on those projects. They're ongoing, and we believe we will be entitled to a credit that will obviate the need for that last $300 million plus payment. So by making those timely payments with surplus dollars, one-time money, and by establishing that we're entitled to credit, we're hoping that we can fully erase that long-term hurricane debt, which will be very significant for future taxpayers of the state. We have significant liquidity through our interfund borrowing process, where the state basically takes money that comes in and uses it to fund the ongoing operations of budget. And the general fund, as of the beginning of this year, had a positive cash position over $1 billion, with our borrowable funds being actually up to $6 billion. We don't need that, obviously, but that represents a level of stability that we've not necessarily seen over long periods of time that we have now. As you know, we're required to pass and maintain and end the year with a balanced budget. Unlike the federal government that can go trillions of dollars into debt, the state of Louisiana has to balance its budget every year. It doesn't have the luxury of borrowing whatever it wants. There's a limit on how much we can borrow, up to 6% of our general fund budget. So we have appropriate limitations on our debt structure, and it's monitored monthly, reported to JLCB on a monthly basis, as is a very conservative 5-year revenue estimating forecast that by statute goes to JLCB every month as well. So that's just kind of a general summary of the overall positions. We told them. You're not going to be able to see some of the charts that I have available today, but we can make this document available to any of you who may want to have it as a follow-up, because it does provide some very extensive information. But one of the fundamental points that was made was that our economy is performing better than we had anticipated, and that our operating performance is consistently strong. I'm going to show you something that you're not going to be able to see, except you'll be able to see the bar graph lines going down on the left-hand side and going up on the right-hand side on that blue bar graph. What that tells you is what you've heard me talk about for a long time, particularly beginning 8 years ago, that when this administration came in, Governor Edwards walked into the door and faced a $1 billion budget shortfall that grew to $2 billion for the next year budget that we were responsible for preparing. That's those negative lines that you see on the left side of that chart. The right side that goes in the proper direction going up shows you the surpluses that we've had for each of the past 6 years. We were not able to generate a surplus in that very first year when the corrective measures were taken to pass some taxes, make some budget cuts that were needed to make certain we had a balanced budget. But for every year thereafter, Louisiana has had a surplus. And that surplus is constitutionally directed on how it can be spent. 25% must go to the rainy day fund, 10% to unfunded accrued liability, and the remainder must go for coastal projects, transportation projects, or general one-time construction expenses related to the capital outlay budget. So very important safeguards are in place with any surplus dollars that we've had. That has enabled us to make significant investments over the course of the past 6 years because we had a surplus every year, and we're directed on how that money should be spent. And our income, as I say, continues to perform well. Another one of the, again, you're not going to be able to see this, but I'm going to show you just so you can have an idea, because it's very colorful and it's significant. The one on the right side. The red that you see is the amount of money generated by sales taxes every year from 1979 forward. The yellow is mineral revenue. And you can see what it looked like in 1979 and what it looks like today. The blue line represents income tax, which was very small when we had that much oil and gas revenue coming in, but has grown over the years as we become more dependent upon sales tax and income tax to balance our budget, which is why any discussion about eliminating the income tax, though it certainly sounds good and very few people are not for the idea of eliminating a tax, that gives you an idea of why it's so important that funding source has to be replaced if we are to maintain the level of services that we have right now and the investments that we're making. Corporate income is the green, which is fairly steady through the years. We never quite know when it's going to come in. And I'm sorry, the green is other. The low blue is corporate, which is relatively speaking, relatively low. But it's very important in the scheme of things to describe where we are with our savings ability, because the Revenue Stabilization Fund, not to be confused with the Budget Stabilization Fund. Budget Stabilization Fund is the rainy day fund that is now higher than it has ever been in history since its establishment. That is the money that is constitutionally specified to go to UAL, the surplus to go to that rainy day fund. But the Revenue Stabilization Fund, created only a few years ago, was an aspirational fund. At the time it was enacted, there was not a real comfort level that it was going to produce any real income real quickly, because it's a combination of some mineral revenue over a threshold amount, but most significantly, any amount over $600 million a year in corporate income must go into this Revenue Stabilization Fund. The Revenue Stabilization Fund is now over $1 billion. It's higher than the Budget Stabilization Fund. So to the rating agencies, we say Louisiana has 2 savings accounts that cannot be rated or used absent a 2/3 vote of the legislature. And the Revenue Stabilization Fund can only be used in an emergency. So we have the Budget Stabilization Fund, the rainy day fund that we can draw on. We had to draw on it in the very first year of this administration. But the Revenue Stabilization Fund is sitting there not being able to use absent a 2/3 vote and only being able to use for an emergency. So it is truly a significant savings account that the state has that has not been something we could tell rating agencies in the past that we had available to us, but we can do so now. Obviously, the rating agencies are interested primarily in budget stability. They're interested in making certain that you have a funding base that is consistent, which is why we were very adamant about the need to make tax reform a priority when we first came into this job 8 years ago, and what was finally enacted just a couple of years ago. But the rating agencies are particularly interested in that tax structure that's been created because it actually has a trigger that limits the amount of money you're going to get on income tax. And this was important to discuss, and it's important to consider in the context of the way we've presented the budget this year. We have repeatedly talked about the unforgivable budgetary process of using one-time money for recurring expenses, which was the norm in the previous administration, and that created that $1 billion and $2 billion budget problem that we have. But the corollary is not true. It is okay to use recurring money on non-recurring purposes, because that has a twofold impact. Number one, you're not growing the budget by automatically putting that money on recurring expenses. And secondly, it gives you an additional opportunity to make investments that you otherwise were not contemplating, but for the fact that you had this recurring money available to you that you didn't think you would have during the initial budget process. So what you're seeing in the budget we've recently presented, it'll be debated when the session starts, is a significant amount of recurring money being recommended for one-time purposes, not simply growing the budget. Now, we are recommending that some of that excess in the current year be used on recurring purposes, like pay raises for teachers, and making the supplemental pay for firefighters and police permanent instead of just on a one-year basis. But by and large, a significant amount of the excess that we've already seen recognized in the current year is being recommended for one-time expenditures. And the numbers that we've talked about, it gets kind of confusing when you're talking about these multiple levels of savings that we suddenly have. So I want to refer to my notes to tell you exactly. Our surplus from the year that ended on June 30th of last year was $726.5 million. That's what has to be spent, 25% to rainy day, 10% to UAL, everything else on one-time purposes. The projected excess from the Revenue Estimating Conference when it last met for the current year is $928.5 million, almost $1 billion in revenue that we have in the current year that we did not think we were going to have when REC last met. That is because REC has traditionally and appropriately funded or made its recommendation very conservatively. We have always taken the lower of the two recommended forecasts from the Legislative Fiscal Office and the Division of Administration, and we have say it correctly, we have been conservative and always taken the lower budget estimate rather than being optimistic that we'll do much better, because that can get you in trouble, which is what happened previously. That's $1.65 billion in one-time money that we have to spend during this upcoming session. And the forecast change for next year, the budget that will begin on July 1, at the last REC meeting, increased that estimate by over $600 million, $608 million, that we didn't think we would have to budget until REC met most recently. Now, as always is the case, REC will meet again in May, probably after the House has sent the budget to the Senate. And at that May meeting, our projections are that we will continue to see an increase in revenue in both the current year and the year that begins on July 1. I cannot give you an estimate of what that will be, but I can tell you, based upon the conservative estimate that is in place and the information we have seen thus far in our sales tax receipts, gives us every reason to be optimistic that we're going to have even more money available to be spent during this year's session. It will be important, I think, to make certain we maximize the use of that money on significant one-time efforts that are very critical to us. Now, for the record, just so you know the numbers, Moody's upgraded the state's GO rating bond to AA2 from AA3 in May of 2022. That's the only upgrade we've seen during our time of the 8 years here under Governor Edwards. Standard & Poor's and Fitch currently have a GO bond rating that is AA-. These ratings put us about in the middle of the pack with 10 states who are on the bottom end of the 50 states. More states than us are higher ranked, and few states, 6 have ratings lower than us, and 10 have ratings exactly as we are. We think the progress that we've made and where we've come from absolutely justifies those rating agencies taking another look at our ratings and improving our standing. We'll have a GO bond issue coming up in the not too distant future. We're hoping that they will act quickly enough after this meeting to take some action that will be positive sooner rather than later. But we also recognize that the agencies are often slow to upgrade and are also very cautious given the uncertainty about the national economy right now, the speculation about where we may be or not be in a recession and where we may be going with the Fed's action going forward, as well as just overall questions about the economy. So we have to temper our enthusiasm with the presentation we made to them and the response we got from them with the reality that we may not have overnight success, but we think we've established enough of a base to justify that. We went into great detail with them about our proposed spending practices that I've already talked about, and you've heard when I made the presentation to the Joint Legislative Committee on the Budget as to what our recommendations are for one-time spending and for the raises that I mentioned in the budget. Otherwise, the intent is not to dramatically grow the budget, but instead to use a lot of the money that could be used to grow the budget on non-recurring purposes. I want to go over this because it's important. The executive budget that we have recommended for 24 includes this. I'm sorry, the budget for the current year includes these one-time expenditures. I wanted to outline those so you can see what I'm talking about regarding using what could be recurring money. The legislature already spent $45 million of that excess to create the insurance incentive program that Commissioner Donlin had recommended. So that comes off the top. $20.5 million will be needed to close out the Road Home program. And though this has been written about, I want to take a second to talk about this because this was something I really had as a goal for us during this administration, was to try and reach the point where we could end our obligation back to the federal government from the Road Home program that was reflective of the tragedy and the damage caused to the state by hurricanes Katrina and Rita. Originally, the obligation that the state potentially had was a huge amount, hundreds of millions of dollars. We were able to negotiate with HUD, which is the entity that funded Road Home, to pay them $20.5 million, one-time money that will come out of this year's excess, plus a $12 million settlement that we've reached with ICF, which was the contractor hired by the state to manage the Road Home program, with whom we were in litigation with us saying that ICF had failed in its responsibility to us in managing the Road Home program, resulting in some overpayments to people. ICF saying, no, state, it was your fault because you let us do this and you didn't do some things you were supposed to do. We had potentially extensive and expensive litigation pending that had been basically put on hold since we came into office, since the governor came into office, because both parties have been willing to negotiate a resolution, because we believe the amount in dispute was not as much as it was believed to be, and we wanted to put an end to litigating against Louisiana homeowners who got too much money from the Road Home program. So by virtue of their payment to us, and the check came last week to us, of $12 million added to that $20.5 million, that will be sufficient to close the books with HUD on the Road Home program. There's still a small rental program that remains active that we'll have to deal with, and there's some other smaller grants that are still being handled through our Office of Disaster Management. But this is it for the Road Home. Long overdue settlement after 17, 18 years. We're also proposing to repay FEMA for $100 million in cost shares that we have for the many other storms that have hit Louisiana since those two back in 2005. That will wipe out our obligation to FEMA for those funds. We're proposing $84 million in one-time spending to allow some departments, primarily corrections, to make one-time acquisitions and repairs. We constantly have had to put off acquiring things that are needed and repairing things that are needing to be repaired, but we're using one-time money to provide that in the current budget year. and $36 million for Hurricane Ida and other emergency non-congregate shelter expenses, which is a current estimate of what we have to spend. In addition, out of that excess money that I talked about earlier, the 700 and some odd million, we're recommending $340 million of that go to the Department of Transportation and Development. One-time purposes for the department to use to match federal programs. And as you know, we've got lots of federal money available to us, all of which comes with a requirement of a match, most of which is centered in DOTD, roads and bridges, and we want to make sure that we don't leave any of those federal dollars on the table by not having adequate money to pay our cost share. I mentioned the surplus continuing to grow, and the rest of this, I won't go into any more detail. I'll take your questions, but the rest of the presentation involved charts that had been prepared by the economists who were part of the presentation, information provided by DOTD, by CPRA, and by DNR, which made presentations to them at the water campus. We really wanted to showcase the water campus and the investment that the state had made there that is paying dividends already in terms of work internationally and nationally coming to that facility, coming to the LSU Center for River Studies, and we let them see the model that is there, that if you haven't seen it, you ought to pay a visit to see the river model that replicates the flow of water in the Mississippi River. And to give them a real life version of the kind of thinking that Louisiana is doing to prepare for storms and to prepare for how we react to storms. And that's how we concluded our meeting with them. It was basically a very quick day and a half stay in Baton Rouge for them, but we think a very informative one, and one that we hope is going to pay dividends for us when it's time to rate our bond. So with that, I'll stop, and I think I've left a lot of time. If y'all have questions about that or about anything else, I'll try and answer them.
Hey, Jay, Betsy asked for a $3,000 pay raise, but we're going to use $1,000 for certain teachers. Do you have an opinion on that?
All right, the
across the board?
question is, Bessie has recommended a $3,000 pay raise, is what you said, Will. Is that right? Their recommendation was $3,000, with $1,000 being used for a particular category, I think, of teachers. And do I have an opinion on that? My opinion on that is the same as stated by the governor. We are committed to a $2,000 pay raise for teachers in the budget that we have proposed. We would like an additional $1,000 to go to teachers if and when REC improves our forecast at that meeting that will take place in May. And we'll have continued discussion about how that is broken up or how that may be paid in some manner or form. But right now the position is we absolutely have proposed the $2,000. We want to propose the extra $1,000. We want it to go to teachers.
And it's always been across the board that they do.
That's right. That's right. It's across the board is my understanding. Lenny?
While it may be a good budget practice to not use the recurring revenues or use them for one-time purposes, two of the biggest, frankly, failures in the Edwards administration over the past year have been the virtual collapse of juvenile justice and the scandalous, not a scandal per se, I guess, the scandalous mistreatment that has occurred in DCFS children in their care. Those are recurring dollars that have to be spent on that.
Right.
How does this budget address those two?
It addresses both of them by providing additional TOs, Table of Organization employees, for both DCFS and for Office of Juvenile Justice. Our challenge there has been, and we've talked about this repeatedly, has been the ability to find people who are willing to take these difficult jobs or to get them to stay in the jobs once they take them. Pay is a big consideration. Working conditions is a big consideration. And those are not excuses. Those are just realities of what we've had to deal with. The budget does provide increases in funding for those areas. That's part of what is recommended for recurring expenditures. So it's one of the reasons why the entirety of that excess in the current year is not going to one-time expenses. It's a balance of taking some money and putting it in one-time expenses and taking some money and putting it in growth areas of the budget where it's needed. And primarily that's in salaries. We had a great working relationship with the Department of Civil Service in recognizing the need for special entrance rates for some of these positions, for pay increases where appropriate, and we've had good results there. We've also had good results with job fairs, and I wish we'd been more aggressive with these job fairs early on because they've proven to work. Now, the proof in the pudding will be if these newly hired employees stay on the job, because once they face the reality of the difficulties in both those two areas, if history is any teacher, we're going to lose some of them, just like they've done in those departments over the course of the past 2 years. So it's certainly not something that has been neglected by this administration. We've had a very proactive effort, particularly since the two crises arose in both those two areas. Melinda?
Jay, can you talk about, I know there's a teacher pay raise in the budget and faculty pay raise money and those kind of things, but can you talk about pay raises included in the budget for rank and file workers?
I can't tell you, I don't have it in front of me how much it is, but the pay scale that has been put in place by civil service and has been approved by the legislature has a steady increase every year for state employees, which is built into the budget and which we would plan to fund. And even if it's not funded, they have to be made by the departments out of their existing budget. So that is in place. We've also guaranteed a minimum wage of $10 for all state employees, because there actually were some state employees. It's not a huge number, but it was significant enough to make certain that we addressed it, to make certain that no one working in state government is being paid less than $10 an hour as their minimum wage.
Do you know how many people?
I don't. I should, but I don't have it right off the top of my head. But I can get that for you.
Jay, on the $320 million or so for DOTD and matching funds, do you have any idea how that money would be used, or is this a Eric Calabota question?
Yeah, well, he can give you a lot more detail than I can. The question is how would the $340 million in one-time money for DOTD be used? And there are several answers. He can give you a lot more specifics. There are particular projects that have come in over budget. The bids, as you know, are coming in way over based upon the supply chain shortage and just the escalation of inflationary costs. We want to make certain that we provide enough funding to not stop projects that are either in queue or are in line to begin being in queue. So some of that money will go for that. Some of that money will go for taking advantage of federal dollars that become unexpectedly available during the year. I say unexpectedly because at the beginning of the year, we don't know how much money other states will return because they haven't used their allocation. When that happens, we've been very aggressive in jumping in line and saying, we've got the match money, we'll take those federal dollars. And so that will be a component of the money that they have available to be able to take advantage of funds that are available only because other states didn't use them. And finally, as you know, the huge, almost unfathomable amount of money that has been allocated by the United States Congress to states and municipalities in the wake of the pandemic has created an unprecedented opportunity for us to do some long-term investing in roads and bridges. And we don't know how many of those projects that are competitively bid we will be awarded, but we wanted to create a pot of money, and our recommendation is at least $50 million to use in the event that we are competitively awarded grants for which we are applying. And we have been very aggressive in working with Mitch Landrieu, working with the national folks to understand the timing of when particular competitive grants are going to be available, and trying to make certain we position ourselves in every department that may have access to those potential dollars to go after them, and to make certain that we have some money set aside to use as match in the event we are successful. And I would predict and hopefully optimistically believe we will get some of those kind of projects, but we'll have to have the money to be able to fund them. So that's another potential use of that money. That's not the only money that's going to go to DOTD. We're also we'll be making recommendations in the capital outlay budget, and depending on what happens with the next REC meeting from potential excess in the current year, as well as the approximately 1/3 of the surplus from last year that will be allocated in our proposal to DOTD. Yes, sir.
Commissioner, did the negotiations with the government over cleaner money include any discussion of a discount for the Corps of Engineers having fouled it up in the first place?
Well, whether it was stated in that unique way that you have stated it, I would say no, that was not handled that way. But there were certainly negotiations with them to recognize the contribution that the state had made to supplement the work that had been done, and to recognize the fact that the project had, that a bunch of these projects had not been delivered on time. We should not be having to pay the astronomical interest that was part of the agreement that was signed at the outset of this, when we were under the pressure and under the gun to rebuild and to build the storm protection system. So all that definitely factored in, and at the end of the day, the $20.5 million is a good investment for the state to offset any other liability that we may have had. And I think HUD believed it was a satisfactory and appropriate amount to close the books on Katrina, and most importantly, in the litigation against Louisiana citizens.
Is any of the surplus money being designated or considered to be designated for the colleges and universities and their deferred maintenance?
Question, is any of the surplus being delegated to colleges and universities for their deferred maintenance? Yes. Our recommendation has always been that we CPRA, DOTD, and deferred maintenance. And deferred maintenance, we have consistently allocated at least 50% to higher education campuses out of the money that we get for deferred maintenance that's otherwise used by facility planning for state buildings. And we are recommending doing the same thing, and we are having discussions literally as we speak, as early as this morning, that'll continue later this week, on our recommendations for the supplemental bill that will include excess in the current year. And we're going to have something for a significant amount for higher ed in various categories, including deferred maintenance in that proposal.
Jay, did you get any sense from the rating agencies of if there's a timeline for when they will announce any increase? Or I mean, I know they're particularly cagey and there may never be any communication, but like, have you gotten any feedback from them?
I got very positive feedback from them regarding the visit. And it was, very educational, and they appreciated it. I did not get any indication time-wise or whether anything would happen. I did get the caveats that I mentioned earlier, that, it's an uncertain economic time. We got to evaluate everything. One thing I didn't mention, and I should have when I talked about that change in oil and gas revenue that went from basically being 40% of our budget back in before the first oil bust to now being a minuscule, relatively speaking, part of our budget. The rating agencies still look at Louisiana as an oil and gas state, and we are an oil and gas state, but we attempted to show them and explain to them how our industries are also interested in diversifying their portfolios. Our incredible investment in natural gas, which is going to be certainly a use of energy in the future that becomes a commodity that we have available to produce, that produces jobs and revenue, and foreign trade, which we have more money in foreign trade investment, I think, than any other state. So we made a big deal of explaining to them, don't just look at us as dependent upon our oil and gas revenue in order to assess whether or not we have an appropriate balance and appropriate stability and an appropriate budget structure, which is another phrase that's very important to them, budget structure. And that budget structure in Louisiana has evolved dramatically over the years and continues to evolve as we make some of the changes that were made a couple of years ago regarding income tax, where we did away with the ability to deduct your income tax from your state return, which we were just one of only a couple of states that did that, to now going to lowering rates and hopefully believing this is going to be a better structure long term for the state. So that's a very important part of our message is don't look at us as being one-dimensional in our revenue source, because we're not, and we have an appropriate structural balance in place, and it's not something I don't think that has been recognized as it should be as the agencies are scrutinizing the state's budget practices, particularly over the course of the past 8 years, and particularly given the way in which this governor will leave the next governor with a very healthy budget surplus and a stability that certainly did not exist 8 years ago when he came into office.
Any other questions?
When you talk about the budget, it's easy to sort of bog down in the weeds, the minutia of it all. And I think from a government standpoint, to just look at what's going on and you add to that, there's not much that changes. What would be the vision that is reflected in that budget? How would it change Louisiana?
the budget that we're proposing exceeds what we did last year for higher education. I would say the most significant turning point is a recognition by the proposed executive budgets over the past several years that we need to make the monetary commitment to higher education that had been missing over the previous 8 years, where Louisiana had the worst record in the country for state support of higher education. Tuition went up more dramatically than anywhere else. And we're not only now investing in faculty pay raises, we're offsetting some obligations that the universities other had for unfunded mandates. We're providing increased funding for scholarships for those needy Louisianans who can't afford to go to college. And we're making unprecedented levels of contributions to deferred maintenance, which is a huge budgetary challenge for our universities. And it's a responsibility that the state has that we've been neglecting for too long. And it's one of the reasons why you see us focusing on using one-time dollars for deferred maintenance on those campuses. So I think it reflects a philosophical change in prioritizing higher education and early childhood. I didn't mention early childhood, which is another critical area that everyone talks about. Nobody ever says early childhood education is not needed. Everybody says, and everybody will say in an election year, how important it is to invest in early childhood. And we're proposing to do that as well with recurring dollars and supporting efforts to make certain we have properly trained people working in an educational environment for 0 to 3 as well as K to 12. So I'd say those are the most significant fundamental changes that are afoot in our proposed budget as well as the budget for last year.
Go back to the vision idea. What is the vision for Louisiana that's driving that? Where are you trying to get?
Well, I'll give you my vision for what it's worth. That's all I can do right now. And the governor's, I think, kind of stated what his vision would be. From my standpoint, it is to reverse Louisiana's status at the bottom of lists that we ought to be on the top of, to improve the overall health of our state from a preventive standpoint in particular, to make the kind of investments we need to be making to attract people to the teaching profession, which has slowed down dramatically, and to recognize that long-term the potential growth for the economy and the ability to make our state what we would like it to be rests in education, beginning at birth and carried all the way through post-secondary education, be it a 4-year degree, a professional degree, or a technical license, a technical certificate that provides someone with the training to go immediately into the workforce. That would be my answer to your vision question.
I nominate you to run for governor.
Yeah, that nomination was rejected by the people 8 years ago. But thank you anyway.
How much money is in early childhood in the budget? I thought it was around $46 million.
Yeah, it's two different pots. I don't remember exactly, but it's about 80 million, I think. And I was asked this at a previous meeting and wasn't positive, and it is about 80 million when you combine the various sources of revenue that are available, because they're federal dollars, some of which have gone away that we're trying to supplant with state dollars. Yeah, with state dollars, as well as some of the money we put in last year to basically provide pay raises to the people who are working in the 0 to 3 early childhood arena to make certain they were qualified to provide the kind of educational training that is needed for those infants to get them ready for kindergarten. Yes.
So we're going into our 3rd year of surplus, and the surplus is increasing.
6 years. 6 years.
So they're increasing dramatically. So is there, of the items that feed that surplus, is there one consistent of the items that is leading the charge as far as?
Income tax and sales tax are consistently more than we had forecast. The other components of the budget are not nearly as significant as individual income tax and sales tax. And nobody's asked about this, but that sales tax, that 0.45 cent that is rolling off in just a couple of years, the amount of anticipated excess that we have in the current year almost offsets that amount when added to the money that is being taken from the state vehicle taxes and placed into the sub-fund of the DOTD Capital Construction Fund. So those are two sources that are draining away portions of the general fund, but the excess that has been recognized thus far is almost, it's not dollar for dollar, but it's getting pretty close. We think the total of those two in the out year in 26 is probably about 900 million. The current year excess recognized is over 700 million right now. So again, more projected growth almost gets you to the point where that is offset, which is why I've said it may be a little premature to call it a fiscal cliff. Technically, in that out year from now, the second year of the new administration, that money rolls off. They're going to have to deal with it by either cutting something or providing additional revenue, unless the projections stay on track with where they are right now, at which point maybe there's not a need to raise any new taxes. But it is one of the reasons why we've cautioned against going in and saying, oh, we've got so much money, let's cut something. Let's cut taxes. I mean, that was what happened with the Stelly plan, as we all know, and we've talked about before, when we were on the road to some level of stability until we repealed those portions of the Stelly plan that took away the income tax that was supposedly going to offset the loss of other revenue. And that got us in the big pinch, and that started the process in the previous administration of using one-time money for non-recurring purposes and sweeping funds. By the way, that was another point we made to the agencies. Fund sweeps are part of the past dictionary. They don't exist in this administration. We have not swept funds because you're not supposed to sweep funds, number one. And number two, when you sweep them, that's one-time money. And number three, at some point you got to go back and plug the hole that was created by taking that money from what had been statutorily dedicated. There were many grievous examples, the worst of which was basically taking money that had been advanced to us from the federal government to deal with our hurricane problems and using that money as part of the operating budget, knowing at some point we'd have to give it back. And we gave it back once we got a hold of the budget.
Just one is probably good. Given that you've already said you are not running for governor, but given that so many people in Louisiana recognize the wealth of your experience, your ability to cross party lines, and are proud of so much of the work that you have done competently in Louisiana, would you be interested if, you know how things turn out, being somebody else's commissioner?
I'm not going to speculate on that. But thank you for your comments.